So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Tracy Alice Mark Lai. Tracy Alice Mark Lai is a tenured historian at Seattle Central College. She is co-author of the article Asian American Studies and the Fight for Workers' Justice, published in the spring 2019 issue of the UCLA journal API Nexus. And she's co-author of the book The Snake Dance of Asian American Activism, Community Vision and Power. Tracy embraces the role of scholar activist as activism continues to ground and motivate her teaching, her research, and her writings. She's currently working on an oral history project and a book on APALA, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, along with Kent Wong, the director of the UCLA Labor Center. I'd like to also add that Tracy has been involved with the Wing Luke Museum for many years, always there to support, encourage, and lend her knowledge. And I know there might be some teachers here from the NEH summer workshops that we've done, and it was Tracy who got us started on those. So thank you for all your help and your support in the past years, Tracy, and go ahead and present from now.
Well, thank you, Shar, and thanks for everyone who's come this evening. I'm going to try to switch to sharing a screen here. Thank you. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation. I really appreciate the Wings creating this space for us to be able to try to reflect upon our collective history. And I fully agree with Charlene that when we understand our history, we can better understand each other, and then we can move together to do the kinds of things that need to be done. Thanks for those of you who had a chance to fill out the poll. I realize now that the wording may not have been quite as clear as I had thought when I first came up with it. But as we were thinking about what to concentrate on in this short talk with you, I wanted to start from what we know and what we think about our families' experiences, which may or may not include a migration aspect to it, but is certainly part of this picture. It's part of the fabric of our communities. And so I started thinking about different words that are certainly present whenever you're reading Asian, Pacific Islander American histories, and these were some of those words. And I think it's interesting and I realize not everybody had a chance, and some of you just might not have wanted to do the poll. So this is not the complete picture of all of us together. But the poll said that 81%, so the largest, by far the largest, was that word opportunity. And then next was work. And then there were some in the 40% that, had to do with poverty, had to do with war, military, and so on. So I'm not going to promise that I'm going to explain every single part of that, but I think as we're talking and considering some of the images, we'll kind of wrap back to some of these conditions that have been and are part of our histories. This word cloud probably does not exactly look like a heart. I was using one of those generators, word cloud generators. And so that was the choice. One of the choices was you can make your words look like a heart. And why I chose that is that I'm struck by how, despite the struggle, despite the many kinds of difficulties that come along the way of such a vast relocation, that there can also be a huge amount of love that comes out of that, and that gives us a lot of strength. So we can hold on to that as we go. Charlene and I talked a lot about the title. We knew that we wanted to talk about understanding history, and we had many different possible titles, and where we finally landed was In the Shadows of Colonialism. And I wanted to say just a little bit about that. There all too often, when commenting on Asian American experiences, and we should always be thinking about Pacific Islander brothers and sisters and siblings, you know, the idea of a model minority kind of experience follows just a little too quickly. And that idea of model minority is very much associated with this a very strong stereotype that media, um, initially magazines, but then later other kinds of media commentators have reinforced about the idea that the progress and the relative success of Asian Americans has just been so smooth and so complete. And while there are some amazing and important stories about successes, it really is not an accurate kind of description of the history as a whole. So what I'm hoping we can do together in this short amount of time is to look at the ways in which the US's relationship with the region of Asia and the Pacific has largely created these kinds of shadows. I'm calling it colonialism because as we go for all the way back, or centuries back, that's part of what we're looking at. But certainly many wars, and certainly the militarism that I'll argue is still quite present. I also wanted to visit this idea of, if we're looking at a history that includes this colonialism, what can it mean to decolonize ourselves and our ways of thinking and how we understand these experiences? And so I'd like to suggest that one way of thinking about, as one point in decolonization, is to think about the ways that the very discipline of Asian American studies emerged, because that is certainly a place of struggle. And it was the student strikes, third world students, they described themselves that way at that time because they were in solidarity with third world liberation movements of the 1960s, that they went on strike because they were determined to transform the colleges, the schools that they were at. And it is literally out of that new histories and more research, community-based histories emerged. And I want us to sort of hold on to that as we keep thinking about patterns in history. What I wanted to describe in this next slide is thinking about community history projects that you may already have been involved with or are part of, or just simply familiar with. And I wanted to start with the Wing's practice of convening community advisory committees. They often do that for exhibits. I myself recently got to be part of a committee that helped to produce Hear Us Rise, APA Voices in Feminism. And it was a fabulous experience to have intergenerational conversations, to think about the ways in which APA women have expressed themselves and have worked towards gender equity. In addition to committees such as that, we can also just look at community organizations. We can look at a variety of community institutions and the ways in which they document their experiences. That too is part of our history. I would be remiss if I did not mention community media. And I feel very fortunate to have been able to learn part of my writing skills with editor Ron Chu in the International Examiner. Some of the most challenging writing that I did in order to, frame an interview or capture an article, and that sense of pride and satisfaction to try to help collect that community information. Densho, Japanese American Legacy Project, is also a stellar and inspiring example. Their work as a digital archive has grown from hundreds of interviews, video interviews, to many other kinds of artifacts and documents and curriculum. And it is certainly a national model for many other communities who are seeking to document their history. And then relative to some of our topics, I wanted to note, if you're not familiar already with Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, that there are some really excellent sections pertaining to the Asian American movement in Seattle, including some interviews with activists. There's a great section on Filipino cannery unionism, and there's also perhaps a little less known to some of us, the 1907 Bellingham riots, which drove out the Sikh population. Well, I did want to introduce as one more source a digital archive of my uncle Mark Lai's writings and speeches and some of his other work. He certainly has been an influence in my own work, and I think he felt I was extremely fortunate, I am, to have been able to become involved in writing and teaching in ways that were not open to him as a young man growing up in San Francisco, Chinatown. I have a very strong memory of, the family gatherings at his home in Chinatown, and us children playing ping pong in his basement, and all the walls were just stacks and stacks of newspapers that he felt were too important. He didn't know who would be archiving them, but he felt that, well, I'll hang on to them until they do have a home. And he later went on to work closely with the Chinese Historical Society of America in San Francisco. And then, of course, after retiring from his profession as an engineer, he devoted himself to research and writing, beginning with the East-West newspaper. He even had a radio show with his wife, Laura, and later writing in Chinese, a history of Chinese Americans. And so digital archives, some of you have Chinese language skills. I think you'll also enjoy looking at his work that way. Okay, so back to our topic at hand, thinking about decolonizing and thinking about some of those early starting points for how and why Asia would be exploited in the ways that it was. So I first want to just make a quick reference. I hope Edward Said will forgive me for trying a quick reference because his work is very complex and deserves really deep consideration. But I wanted to bring in the title of his book and just to have this quote as one way of thinking about a kind of perspective and a description of a relationship with the Orient that Said wrote about. And with all of those words, I think you can grasp this idea that the, this demeaning kind of perspective of the so-called Orient, and also that it was a place that could be exploited and have the power imbalance that always comes with control and exercise of power. And part of thinking about that involves appreciating how Asia becomes stereotyped as a place, an exotic place, a place of that is always foreign. And if you bring that element into this idea of whether Asian immigrants can or ever will fit in, or use that word, assimilate, or be accepted in their adopted homes, we can see right away that tension and kind of contradiction. So even as outside empire building countries are looking at Asia as a place to exploit, there is, you know, there are the whole role of trade and control of trade routes, and the goods themselves that are being traded uh, are growing ever more important from about the 15th century onward. And so some of those items I think are, you know, they're familiar to you. Um, and I included this little poster about tea because I think it helps to convey just how widespread or ubiquitous tea has become. Um, and this over many centuries and across many different cultures. And then, you know, you're probably very familiar with the essential role of spices, and many people who sought to find the fastest route to capture those spices. Okay, side by side, changing topics rather quickly, we also want to consider how in a similar time period, the growth of the transatlantic slave trade rises as well. And this would dominate labor throughout the colonies in the Americas. Upwards of 12 million Africans kidnapped from their homes. And all of those interactions are quite defining for other subject peoples. So not everyone will be enslaved in the same way, but the labor that they represent is going to continue even after slavery as a practice is made illegal or abolished. The images that you're looking at, let's see, one is in reference to Indians who were referred to as coolies, who were sent to British colonies. And between 1834 and 1916, approximately 1.5 million Indians were taken out of their homes and labored and oftentimes ended up staying if they survived that harsh experience. The other photo that you're looking at is one of the early ships full of Chinese contract laborers. Ultimately, approximately 500,000 would go also throughout the Americas. It could be the guano mines of Peru. It could have been the plantations of Cuba, maybe those gold fields. If you're of Cantonese origin, as I am, then Gumsan, Gold Mountain, is part of what your family history entails. And then railroad building in many different spaces. So I want us to hold on to and keep in mind that these centuries of enslaved labor, of very cheap labor, labor that might put your family into generational debt, that kind of labor is an integral part of this 19th century and early 20th century experience. Meanwhile, speaking of wars, we'd want to consider the First and Second Opium Wars against China, kind of the first of the drug wars. And while there's many things we could say related to the wars themselves and all of that, we could just consider that in addition to the opium, Britain, France, and any of their allies were especially interested in securing unequal treaties. And these unequal treaties, in every single manner, would favor the foreigners who had this, well, the military power or their close alliance with Britain and France. And I just want to highlight that word extraterritoriality, because that is the word that probably most symbolizes that inequity, because the foreigners were no longer subject to Chinese law. And this was something that they were interested in, because then they could just do as they wished to do, um, and not be accountable, because of the kind of power that they held. The image here is of a political cartoon that is literally showing the division using those knives of China. This map, of course, now I'm realizing it's too small to be able to see all the dates and the years. But if you just look at the colors, you'll get that broad sense of the kinds of colonial holdings that these different countries had in the region, which would then have that legacy of colonialism, yes, by different countries, but certainly present. The US is late to this experience, and they are late because they are a young country, but they certainly want to be just as powerful as these other empires. And so it's American missionaries who will lay the groundwork for the takeover of Hawaii. Those missionaries come in kind of the early 1800s, and then their children are the ones who become those early plantation owners, Sanford B. Dole and others. And it is an act of war that results in the forced annexation of what was the Republic of Hawaii. And nearly together, but I guess really more one after the other, we have another kind of takeover, and that of the Philippines, which is a complicated byproduct of the Spanish-American War, where Spain preferred to surrender to the US rather than the Filipino revolutionaries. And those Filipino revolutionaries were deeply disappointed that the US would betray their independence. They thought they shared that history of throwing off the colonizer, and the US should have been every bit as supportive and excited as they had been about their own American Revolution against Britain. But as you can see from the length of the war, Filipinos were not going to give up. It's an extremely bloody war. And in some ways, because the Philippines is a vast archipelago, you could say that there's never really a complete surrender. Out of all of that, we just want to note that strategic locations for US military bases emerge, or well, they don't just emerge out of the war, sort of the spoils of war, shall we say. The US is able to create those sites. Okay, and then there's more. There are more wars, and each easily deserve their own talk and a lot more details. We're looking at the big patterns, and maybe thinking a little bit about how quickly they follow one upon another. What I have done, and I think Charlene is helping me by putting those links in the chat, and if we can't do it now, they can be sent out at another point. World War II is a very complicated, people often refer to it as a watershed moment for Asian Americans, because for some Asian Americans, such as Chinese Americans, there's that moment of, becoming an ally and having a more positive, as opposed to in the 19th century, a negative, keep them out of here, Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And it's kind of a rehabilitation moment And so this essay about Asian Americans and World War II explores how for some groups it can have that kind of positive association. But on the other hand, for Japanese Americans, it's a complete nightmare because the citizenship, the lives that they have built and created in the United States they're gone in a second. And instead, there's the incarceration for duration of the war, and then some for some groups of people that stigmatizes them as if they were part of that enemy. And we think of General John L. DeWitt's comment that, well, the Japanese race is an enemy race, no matter how many generations removed. And so, again, that kind of whole idea of this stereotype from which we cannot be seen as ourselves with any other kind of a reality. Still Present Pass is a website that has Korean oral histories. Relative to the Korean War, there's many other kinds of archives, including obviously ones by the US military or by veterans of that war. But I do think the Korean experience and perspective on that war and what it meant to be divided as a result and to continue in that divided state is significant to our understanding. And then with the Vietnam War, there's a next slide that will go into more of the community histories relative to that war. But I did feel that a very significant essay is posted on Densho's website, written by Nina Wallace, that goes into the connections between the Asian American movement and opposing the Vietnam War on the same basis that, as a racist war, as an imperialist war, as has been spoken by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., just as an example. The displacement of people by war continues to be a feature of our current time. Thinking back to that Vietnam War, I think that we are beginning to see a new collection, or many collections really, of the oral histories of people who have survived that displacement. And so I've included for you Laotian, Cambodian, and Vietnamese American. And I'm sure they're not the only ones. This is not meant to be the complete works of, but because we're kind of doing these broad strokes, I wanted to make sure that you had a way to look for those individual stories and those family stories. I also wanted to note the Southeast Asian Resource Center because they are a national leader, particularly in advocating around, defending immigrant rights. And in the current period, the thousands of deportations of Southeast Asian youth. Well, actually, they're not all just young people either, but so Southeast CRAC is kind of their acronym. So you might want to take a look at them. So scholars such as Walden Bello, I think he actually has a book by this title. I think it's sitting on my other bookshelf. But Walden Bello and others have remarked upon how the US has tried to regard the Pacific Ocean as, quote unquote, an American lake because of the dominance in terms of, looking at the map, thinking about, and these are just kind of this doesn't really capture this map, all the different kinds of military installations in a given location, but it at least will show you kind of, that bigger overview. As well, if we think about following World War II, the US was entrusted with trust territories, former Pacific Island colonies, such as the Marshall Islands, and yet, even as a trustee, went ahead with 67 nuclear bomb testings on 2 of the atolls, Bikini and Eniwetok of the Marshall Islands. There's a lot that we could say about what would the environmental damage be of that kind of sustained nuclear bomb testing. It continues to affect people of the region. And certainly it's an ocean that connects all of us that are part of that Pacific Rim. It's not as if you can completely contain the toxicities that are released in that way. I also want to note that if we're thinking about what this map suggests to us, the US Indo-Pacific Command, which sort of unifies that military region, there is approximately 375,000 personnel. And I'm not sure that number even captures civilian folks who can be part of those communities, because those communities generate many kinds of needs. The point of looking at all of that is the reminder of the very continued and strong presence that defines relationships in that region. And so, it's not just historical. It's sometimes that's people's main exposure to Asia and the region. Okay, well, that was really quick. And but if we were to just think then about the kind of the scars, the damages that might be part of this kind of long, centuries of legacy, we could certainly think about physical aspects. I mean, I just was talking about the waste, the toxic waste of nuclear testing. Clearly, that's environmental. Clearly, it's had physical legacies on individuals. I think to the term jellyfish babies, the babies who are born without spine because of the radioactive waste. So that's one kind of physical. I mean, you could think about the unexploded ordnance, where all the wars have taken place. That's another kind of physical. But I think you also are aware that there's many other kinds of physical legacies that continue to remind us of what has happened. The mental aspects are, we could talk about psychological, we could talk about cultural, we could talk about, I earlier mentioned words and naming and language. The result of American missionaries and then the imposition of an annexation had really suppressed Native Hawaiian language. And it's been an enormous fight to revitalize the use, the teaching of Native Hawaiian language. So that would be one kind of an example, and there are many others. If we think about institutions, colonialism tends to stunt institutional development because of what colonialism imposes over a community's institutions. And that kind of brings us to this idea of the ways in which the fabric of a community can hold on to these histories. So while that sounds dreary and difficult and depressing. It is harsh. It is hard to look at. I also want us to hold on to this idea that as those things are happening, there is always some kind of resistance. And so, you've probably heard it, this quote in other contexts: where there is oppression, there is resistance. And I think that when we look to those examples, we can see much resilience and a kind of healing. And so in my last slides, I just want to remind us about some of those points of light, if you will. And so the two examples that I just wanted to share have to do with organizing, because I think resistance and organizing are very much connected. And one of the examples is the formation of the Japanese Mexican Labor Association in Oxnard, California, way back in 1903. And it's when you look at what they were able to accomplish with the use of interpreters, because they definitely had not all had a chance to study each other's languages, they were still able to get to where they wanted to be, which was fighting against unfair working conditions and making sure that their wages weren't diminished, or that they weren't pit against each other, that they're working the same kind of fields and they deserve the same kind of wages. Okay, so that's one kind of an example. A little bit closer to our time is the Asian American movement of the late 1960s. And well, if you decide to read my book, we talk about it, how it goes in through the 1980s. But what I want to say about the Asian American movement is that it's a time in which different ethnic groups are able to come together, even though they might not initially see much commonality, from Japanese American to Chinese American to Filipino American to Korean American. Those were the main groups at that particular time. But I think that they found a kind of unity that allowed them to try to influence foreign policy, those who chose to oppose that Vietnam War, or looking into their own communities, addressing community needs, perhaps in housing, for example, or seniors who were otherwise neglected or excluded from other elder care. And certainly, as I already mentioned, students organizing to transform their educational experience. Coming all the way present, we can keep thinking about resistance and solidarity. And in a way, that was one of the reasons Charlene and I talked about, let's understand our history, because we are in a moment of so many movements to gain racial justice. And where do we as Asian and Pacific Islander Americans stand within that? So these are just a couple of photos, but there are many other kinds of actions and organizations who have been involved, and certainly more recently as well. But I did want to kind of leave us with that part, that there are certainly people who are involved in building that solidarity and who are creatively meeting the moment that we are in. This kind of resistance and this kind of building solidarity with others is how we emerge from under those shadows of colonialism and war. So I'm leaving you with a lot of different things to think about, I hope. And one source that might be helpful is, it's called A Different Asian American Timeline. It's a website that was curated, put together, researched by Change Lab, and you can read all about them if you decide to go and look into that. And related but different, organized differently, is this handbook, which is called Asian American Racial Justice Toolkit. And this was the result of a collaboration by 15 grassroots API community organizations. It's been around for a few years, but I think a lot of people are still yet discovering it. And there's kind of these modules. You don't have to go in the order. You can kind of look at the themes and the topics, but it's put together in a way where if you wanted to use it to facilitate an organization's conversation about a topic, it can be adapted for as curriculum in another kind of setting. And I think one of the great strengths of this toolkit is who put it together, and that they draw upon the kinds of histories that we've been addressing tonight. So thank you very much. Gosh, I promised Charlene I would stay under 35 minutes, and I was not successful in that promise, but I'm going to release you from, let's see, the screen share. Stop that. And guess we'll see if there's maybe a few question answer. And actually, Charlene, if I can invite you back to share those closing slides.
Okay, I'm back. I think you mean the closing slides about our upcoming events? I could.
Yes.
I think I'll do that after, because
okay.
I can just let people know what's coming up. So I think at this time, we have a few minutes. If there's any questions from anyone, you can type it in the Q&A, or you can type it in the chat. We're also following the chat. There's a lot of resources that Tracy has put out there too, so you can provide any other resources that you have in the chat. But that's a lot to think about. Oh, Vivian.
Thank you, Tracy. There is one question in the Q&A. You and Shar provided lots of great links of content and curriculum. But one question specifically in the chat was, what resources would you recommend for elementary school? And what focus would you think would be the best to discuss local Asian history and joyful contributions?
Ooh, that is a great question. And I think, seriously, I think I might have to take a little time to do some research since I'm not in elementary education. But I have some friends who are. Yeah. And the fact that you're asking specific to kind of the state of Washington, I think I might have to get back to you somehow. Charlene, here's a question. There's resources that the museum has, but I don't know if resources directed towards elementary school teachers are visible, or you would have had to have been in the seminar to have access. That's a question on my part.
I think if Gentana, if you want to say a few words about that, otherwise we can follow up. But we do have resources on our website. We have, it's just www.wingloop.org/education. And it does talk about some of our resources there. But yeah, I think they come out in forms of workshops from time to time. We do have a workshop coming up on February 27th on the resistors during World War II, Japanese American resistors. That I think is geared more for middle school though. So sometimes it's periodic as to what education we have. We also have, other topics as well. But I see Gentana is unmuted. If you want to add anything else, Gentana, please do.
Yeah, along with our teacher trainings, we also have an online curriculum that usually requires a subscription and costs money, but because of the circumstances going on, it's actually free right now. So you could visit that at curriculum.wingluke.org.
Thanks, Gintana.
Shar, hi, this is Cassie. Would you like to share about the NEH Landmarks of American History workshop opportunity too? That seems like a good opportunity for teachers.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Cassie. And actually, I kind of mentioned it at the beginning, but Tracy was the one that came to the museum a few years back and said, hey, this is a workshop that I attended for faculty members, and you can also do this for K through 12 teachers. So we did, we applied to the NEH and we got grant money to put on week-long teacher workshops. And this summer we have two workshops, and they'll be all online, but we're still going to be able to visit online some of the landmarks in this area, including the Chinatown International District, historic buildings, the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial, the Khalsa Gurmat Center, that is a Sikh school and community center. We'll be looking at we'll be basically learning about the history and learning about the curriculum that you can use in your classroom. And it is geared for K through 12. I think one of the biggest assets is that you'll be able to work with the education team at the museum. And you'll also be able to work with the other teachers that will be part of the workshop. We have spots for 36 teachers each of 2 weeks, and it's an application process. So we have more information about that at on the wingluke.org/education website as well. The other really great thing about this workshop is that teachers get a stipend. They get $1,300 when they complete this program, and it's all online. So hopefully, you know, that will go for your lunches and not for housing. So I guess that's a silver lining during the time of COVID.
Let's see, there's a good question about the racialized hate speech, you know, China flu, Wuhan flu, and so on, and questions related to actions or defamation lawsuits. You know, I haven't been following it that closely. I know that San Francisco State, along with in conjunction with a community partner, set up a whole kind of reporting system, because I think they felt that it was just really dispersed. And, you know, the feeling was that nationally, yes, there's been a terrible kind of upsurge. But I don't know about lawsuits, whether those have gone forward. And, you know, some of them, I think there is definitely a basis, but whether, you know, the individual feels like pursuing it and has kind of the legal resources, because, you know, it's a lawsuit is an undertaking. That's a really good question. Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness.
We have a question about him, Mark Lai, and your relationship to him, and what is your migration story?
Oh, well, thanks. Thank you for that question. So Mark Lai was my uncle. He passed away in 2009. And so it's on my father's side. And so, you know, I was, you know, the one niece who was interested in history. And so he, you know, he was just very encouraging. He would share his writing. My mother also made sure I knew about all the things that he was writing about. And a few times I was able to contribute to some of the research he was doing, because he was very interested in Chinatowns and their community infrastructure. So he did, like, you know, histories of the family associations, histories of the Chinese language schools, you know, like pre-1940, things of that nature. Yeah. So, and he was born in Chinatown. I was also born in Chinatown, but, you know, I'm the third generation, and he was second generation if we're counting the migration of his parents in the 1910s as first generation, and they were detained at Angel Island. Mhm. Yep. Oh, here's a very easy question. Some of you are asking some really hard ones. Thank you, though. So an easy question is about documentaries to recommend. I think that recent meaning it was released in this area May of 2020, called Asian Americans, and it's a PBS type of documentary. It's got a really strong, you know, overview of kind of the history, but it also tries to come present. So that's that would be just for history. And then there are a lot of really interesting other kinds of documentaries that are, you know, that have already been released or are being released. You could keep an eye on the Seattle Asian American Film Festival. I hope I said their name right. I know they're coming up soon. It's going to be a virtual one, but they're always trying to, you know, help to promote, shine the light on films that are just out and what filmmakers are doing. And then, well, let's see. Yeah. So that's just a couple. That's a good question all by itself. Okay. Well, okay, here's a question about Chinatown history and yeah, well, and gosh, so so there are certainly books that are really specific, like one of my co-authors, um, Michael Liu, recently, like in the maybe last fall, published a book about urban development and gentrification issues in Boston Chinatown. So I'm happy to recommend that book. If you were thinking about kind of closer to home Chinatown, you know, there are both essays and, okay, got to think of all the titles. There's been some histories written about the Chinatown International District. There's certainly histories written just on San Francisco Chinatown. So it's a great reference library question. I'm going to say, you know, email one of the reference librarians at any of our public libraries, and they can probably help get a more comprehensive list for you.
Tracy, maybe one or two more questions. I know there's a lot of great questions in the chat, and for those of you who didn't get your question answered, we apologize about that. We can also be looking at the questions. Maybe these are some topics that you'd like to see in future programs as well, but just in the interest of time, maybe pick one or two more. Tracy, thanks.
Okay, oh, this is hard. Well, here's a question about ways to combat the model minority myth in both outside influences And then also within our own community, let's see, well, so I think disaggregation of data about the Asian Pacific Islander community is actually really important for, because especially with post 1965 immigration. So I'm using 1965 because that was one of the first reforms, that kind of opened the door to Asians who had just been waiting years and years and years for family reunification. So when we can look at the disaggregation, it becomes a lot clearer how it's like that there's like quite a spectrum, in terms of the different so-called success indicators. So that's one thing. I guess that's, I know who wants to sort through all that data, but it gives us a much more complex picture. And really, just to remind, this state of Washington has a Commission on Asian and Pacific American Affairs, and they have some really interesting reports on their website, which help, again, to really look at the complexities. We are not all doing well. There are communities who are in extreme poverty. There are communities that, all of those things. So, and then I think for in our own communities, I think just learning our histories. And I know not everybody, I don't want to go take some history class, but I do think that when we can learn more about those histories, the complexities can help us pull back from the temptation to just sort of smooth everything over and say, oh, the success is, you just got to work harder. That and well, we all are working really hard, and there are these structural systems that disallow the kind of, what, up the ladder mobility that we would all like to experience, but we need to have that reality check of the systems in place. I think I took a long time answering that, and I think I probably should excuse myself from trying to field the other really great questions, but maybe to let the staff end their day. It's been a long day since they, hosted us all.
Did you have a chance to look at all the questions?
Okay, right. This is a very easy one. So just as related to my name, Tracy Alice Mark Lai, and you might have noted him Mark Lai. So Mark is the anglicization that happens to a lot of Chinese names, but you might hear it as Ma, something that somebody else might write out as M-A-K, or I've seen people with the M-O-C-K. But that's our actual family name, and Lai is the paper name. Yep, I'm that paper granddaughter. So with that, I think we wish you well. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Tracy. It was so nice to just listen to you, even though they're hard topics and stuff that's hard to learn about. And I think everybody's interested in continuing to learn from the resources that you gave us, and maybe hearing more talks like this. So just want to thank you again for being here.